But going back to the 60s, when I first came across this, don't do that, you can't do that, this is wrong, that's wrong, routine, it was in schools. In the second, third, fourth, fifth grade, all these rules. You can't go outside. We're born outside. So you can't do this is where you start to see this disconnect on a language basis come into play between generations at the very same time that the authority structure of villages began to get parked, put into a non-used category. The immediate result was, as I said, about the 60s, was this horrible explosion of expression of individual liberties. But I'm interested primarily in the 60s. You know, the 60s is kind of like the tipping point for the changes. So the 60s brought in all kinds of different kinds of authority. They brought in like alcohol, drugs, violence. Up until the 60s, family violence was almost non-existent. Central to the idea of the 60s being the litmus point or the point of no return to a certain degree, all of the trauma, all of the enormous deaths and all of the confusion, impacts, everything that happened up until the 60s was absorbed by my mother's generation and before them. We started that in the 60s. My mom's generation is, once the village is at peace, we can smile and we can dance. It's always we. It's never I. So the we ended about 1960 when I was about 10 years old. And the I began about then. So I want to do this. I want to do that. I should do this. I should get this. I should have that. No we. No what you would call ongoing cycle of reinforcing the idea that what's good for the tribe is good for everybody, what's good for the individual isn't good for anybody but the individual. We began to run into that at the conclusion of the 60s. That's when the drug outbreaks and all of the craziness happened. And when you start to fast forward, you begin to trace the constant deterioration of these safeguards that were in place to produce a value-based system of a group of people like myself whose duty and responsibility was to be healthy, stay healthy, learn how to talk healthy, learn how to live healthy, and most of all, produce health as an outcome of our time. That's what the original system did. So as you can see, by the time we got to the 60s, all of that was parked or pushed aside by this new paradigm. Culturalization is a little bit like saying, well, the best way to fix it is to initiate mind control projects. And I know what it's supposed to mean. It's really a benign term. It's something that research activities utilize a lot. So I know that that particular term is very useful. But the bottom line is, to somebody like me, it means fixing your mind and having you do things that I think is good for you. So that's the issue I have with it. When A people meet A people, you either have an exchange or one or the other dies. That's it. Pretty straightforward.
We're going to change that definition in our class. I can see that coming.
So exchanges is what I'm talking about. We learn to exchange our values in an everyday setting in a connective sense. We solve the problem. Take a look at something called the Behavioral Health Aid Manual. When Tina and I started out on the behavioral health, the problem I ran into, and she and Tina was aware but couldn't describe it, was that imposed throughout the traumatization process was this thing about don't bring back evil by talking about it, invoking it. If you're not a licensed medicine man, a trained medicine man, a certified medicine man, and you don't have the protection of the language, don't go out there and stir the pot and bring everything back, which is exactly what Tina and I were asked to do within the context of the manual, along with our esteemed colleague, two of them actually. So we were asked to violate some of the taboo imposed upon our medicine people, fiefdom, by producing this thing. And we had to come to grips with that issue between ourselves. Do we want to do that? Is the payback? Do we want to actually expose a way of thinking and talking and teaching that had gone away a long time ago for very specific reasons? And now there's traditional law bars people like me from talking about her specifically to strangers. And your students who's watching this, of course, are strangers. So we had to sit down and wrestle with this moral, ethical dilemma about hidden knowledge being cast into the public eye. With me, it was a question of who's going to profit from this. With Tina, it's a question of what traditional laws are we going to break. So getting from there to there on the BHA manual required an adjustment within ourselves about the question on a moral basis, ethical basis, and what you would call I hate to use the term traitor. A better term would be probably saying defying our traditional boundaries in order to proceed to the completion of this book. So the Behavioral Health 8 manual in itself created a lot of what you would call stress, because it wasn't something that had been ever brought forward. So after about a year, we just decided the long-term outlook of having something like this was too valuable just to walk away from. So we kind of said, hang the consequences. We're going to do this. And I remained more or less caught in the moral ethical dilemma, representing a family of medicine people, untrained, unlicensed, and never accepted properly as a medicine man. I remain the more reluctant one of the group. Once Tina decided it needed to be done, she went, boom. Once I decided it needed to be done, I kind of said, do I really want to do this? Do I really want to do this? But we went ahead and started and eventually finished the BHA manual. And in that manual, I had to do certain tweaks, which is important for students to remember. Now, we've had an extended discussion here already on the issue of language. And I wanted to bring that up for the purpose of applying that discussion to what happened with our manual. The term spirituality did not come up hardly at all in the manual itself, because spirituality was the modern day Christian outlook on spirituality was that it was a function, un-Christian function of a society that had left God. So spirituality to a modern day, in a modern day sense, was offensive to Christian groups. So the term didn't come up early on in the discussion. Later on it did in the Behavioral Health Manual. It was kind of an added-on. I was one of them that made the decision, or for myself, I made the decision I would not use that term because I didn't want to antagonize Christian groups. I regard them as potential allies, and I didn't want to throw dirt in their face by throwing this term spirituality in their face. spirituality makes perfect sense to me, is a part of our tradition, and is one of the reasons why my mom and her generation was so adaptive and resilient. But I was not going to go out there and use it as a flag to stir up potential allies. We're all in the same business with different approaches. That's one of the items we ran into on a issue of the use of the English language that didn't really solve anything but created more problems. The other one was a very term medicine man. Most of people's understanding of medicine people come out of Hollywood. It was a taboo subject in most research papers, and very few indigenous people would talk about medicine people to strangers. So the chance of actually having a down-to-earth, everyday discussion about what they were, who they were, why they were, when they were, and what they were, never occurred. Actually, I shouldn't say never. I've seen stuff lately that, I'm very suspicious of. They look like plagiarized activities. That's a different thing. So I shouldn't say never. I should know by now. English is very, very tough to handle. Never is not something we want to bring in discussion. Let's put it this way. The vast majority of literature on medicine people that I've seen, run across, read, or dealt with, if not wrong, and if not misleading, then we're basically what I would call made up, especially if you got into Hollywood. And most people's mental picture of medicine people are Hollywood. So I wanted to dispense with the Hollywood stereotype in the behavioral health manual. Because here's what I wanted to see, or what I knew, was that we would never get to the healing process until we dealt with our healing activities total in the past. Everything that we had, everything that we used. And medicine people were such a vital function part of the healing process, you couldn't leave them out. And I tried to bring across the point in the manual. I'm not asking for medicine people to come back. What I'm saying is a lot of what they did was absolutely legitimate and had a time and a place and a way to be utilized for the function and purpose of healthy communities, and then healthy families, and then healthy individuals. In the modern day application of clinical activities, there is no family, there's no community, it's the individual only. But I wanted to show that you can't have healthy individual unless you have healthy family. And you can't have healthy family unless you have healthy community. That created a dilemma because I had a pretty good idea of what medicine people actually were. There were various classifications of types of healers except for one classification, and I invented the term sorcerer so I wouldn't call him what he actually was, which would violate the bar against calling a person of that type by what they were or who they were. So I invented the term sorcerer as a euphemism for a specific type of individual in our original society who we considered to be a person without a soul. And since they were a person without a soul, they had no heart, and they were perfectly capable of dealing with evil. In the world that we came out of, that sustained us for tens of thousands of years, we had some original laws that were very, very specific. We never let good deal with evil. So we had to have something that dealt with evil. And that something is a person without a soul who in themselves were lost. Rather than say what that person was, what it did, and write up a big description, I just said, okay, that's a sorcerer component. And then we put in place the other three. Now, there's actually three classifications, but I mixed two. Or I took and divided one into two components so that we had four classifications. For reasons I'm not going to get into now, but it's related to the way the English language doesn't fit the traditional language. So if you look at the question of the manual, you run into the very first serious look at, can you take our original practices and apply it on a modern day basis to specific problems like domestic violence, suicide, what have you. I said yes. Tina said yes. Rita Blumenstein said yes. Maida DeWitt said yes. Then came the problem, how much of this English language that we have to contend with will serve our purpose? Very little. So the destructiveness of the traumatization process from epidemics, pre-contact, and the wars as a result were happenstance. That's why my mother and her family and everybody else in that generation were able to adapt and be resilient, because they recognize it as a meteor that fell out of the sky and crushed everything for a period of time. Everything burned, and then it's going to stop and start all over. So in the 30s, when my mom was born, they said, well, it's done, let's start over. Racism never ends, ever. So you have to keep the two totally separate in your mind, compartmentalize two different boxes when you're doing BHA stuff, because it's very important that you understand you can be adaptive and resiliency on this behavior, but you can't be on this behavior. And it's critical when you're dealing with connectivity on a day-to-day basis that you're aware of these kinds of differences. So all of the activities that my generation ran into was designed to do this one thing we talked about already, which is to take any authority, remaining authority structures within that community and that village away from me and replace it with a westernized colonial version. The military expedition did go through our area. They left journals and they did things. They were part of the landscape. What they did not know was that for a great deal of the time and for a long time afterwards, after they came through the contact phase, they were avoided extensively by the people who were there. A separate question on that comes up is, what happens when you do that? Well, that gives the incoming colonial power the ability to raise the flag and say, there's nobody here, so this is our country. Entirely wrong, for a different reason. So you can see why now we're beginning to look at the question of if something is going to go wrong, how wrong will that go? Very, very wrong. Colonization is racism, period. That's all there is to it. End of discussion, very damaged, very mean, very bad. Traumatization from epidemics and the destruction and what have you is a condition that's related to chance encounters. The old-time terminology, which never really got to be a part of the modern lexicon, this connectivity way of looking at the world is the basis for what we call now spirituality. The modern day application of spirituality is related to the covenant that tribes had with the Creator to value all life equal and as highly as possible to each other. Come over to the other side and say, what is it that made a Yupik, an Inupian, a Tlingit, a Tsimshian, an Eyak, an Atna, a Gwich'in, what was it that made them healthy and well 250 years ago? Let's put those in the back of that book and say, here is our ultimate value system that we are striving to go to. And our language, the indigenous language we use in healing and the chief language in peacemaking, was not about punishment. It was not about the issue of somebody doing wrong. It was about the issue of putting a not complete person back in touch with themselves so they could become a complete person. So how do you develop connectivity? How do you develop connectivity to a generation that's getting more and more isolated as time goes by? Well, there's certain aspects of languages that are inherent. They're just there as no matter what. One of them that I use a lot is we need to talk. Not I have a problem or you have a problem, but we need to talk. We need to visit. The older Indians, my mom's generation, they would say, we need to go visit. They didn't say, that doggone Jim, he's got a big bad alcohol problem. He's been on a bender for 3 months. They didn't say that. They didn't make Jim a bad guy. They said, we need to visit. And you go and visit. That's the beginning of the connectivity. So connectivity is all about the outside working in. And it doesn't mean you have to violate confidentiality. It doesn't mean you have to break laws. It doesn't mean that you have to upset the universe or dump over the apple cart. It just means be aware of the fact that connectivity is the key. And to practice connectivity, you have to learn what grandparents are, what great uncles are, what family roles are. So you really need to submerge yourself in the idea of you have to understand what the family is before you can deal with the individual. So our country went silent, quit singing, quit dancing, went into hiding, disappeared into the mountains, and then came contact. The most common way of working in crisis management amongst people who are damaged is to start in the middle of something and go in both directions, whether it's a conversation, a project, doesn't matter. But the old traditional language, the Indians, the one my mom grew up with, they have very simple approach. They say, start at the beginning and proceed, never in the middle. That brings us up into about 30 years of contact, somewhere around 1820, somewhere in that neighborhood, maybe 1810. And the response of the medicine man finally was, let's take everybody and scatter them out to the winds. Small group over here, small group over there, small group way over there, small group way over there. Impose martial law. No one will mix with each other anymore. We'll put groups together that will have representative of this language and that language and kind of overlook arranged marriage governance components that was in place. Our jurisdiction and governance components were predicated upon arranged marriages. That's how we got our original jurisdiction system in place. The medicine man, in the struggle to survive, decided we're going to have a little arc of people over here and a little arc of people, and we're going to have all these languages and all these different things go with the people. With the commandments, thou shalt not mingle. Even more so, thou shalt not deal with strangers. Strangers is part of the reason why these dying occur, so you stay away from them. So let's look at the cumulative impact of the epidemics. What did it do when it came in? Massive death, we know that. Well, very high attrition rate, probably around 90%. It was sudden, it was dramatic, it happened over a period of 5 to 10 years is my guess. The aftermath created starvation and then several more successive waves of various epidemics came in. The immediate impact of the Great Death was to surmise or come to the conclusion on a people basis that we were being visited by a great evil. Now, in indigenous societies, when you are visited by great evil, it's generally surmised, or the conclusion is that you're visited by great evil because of infractions of prior conduct. So the first impact, the first part of the Great Death would be a time of examination. What is it that we did wrong in our past that brought this upon us? So the replacement language had two sources: the religious communities, the missionaries, and the authoritative communities. That's the military, the game wardens, the Alaska State Troopers. So the language that came into being in my mom's time between my mom was born in 1934. So her time in terms of dealing with what you and I would refer to as trauma on a generational basis was in the late 30s through World War II. So she would be more closely tied in with the military's first appearance in Alaska, which was a second major traumatic shock to our society, the military's incursion into Alaska. So the language itself has all kinds of problems in terms of succeeding generations. You have only two kinds of language: authority or religious. The original application of our language in terms of communication went silent for a lot of reasons, and I'll go into it a little later. So to be very specific about how we use language, we tend to trip ourselves up on a short-term and a long-term basis within the educational component, because we have generation after generation where the language that they adopted continues to evolve or maintains multiple meanings. So you might have 5 generations in a household. Each one of them will use a term, like let's say trauma. It'll have 5 different meanings, or it'll have meanings to 4 generations, but the 5th one, being too young to understand terminology, will simply adopt the confusion of the first 4. That's a short course on why it's so tough to talk about these things in a modern day context. Before you deal with language, you got to understand what language was. That's the problem with English. Nobody knows what the heck it was. It came out of the old royal hierarchy. It's a property language. It's a language that the entitled class used to protect themselves and preserve their interests. And that doesn't work in Indian country. It hasn't worked when we first developed a language. It won't work today. So you don't have a property language ever involved in a healing activity, ever. You just not only confuse the subject, but you throw the whole thing out the window. So English is not a healing language. Unfortunately, it's the only language in the land. So it's incumbent upon us to change the way English is used. So we'll get to that in a bit. All of the language that everybody learned back then was about, you can't do this, you can't do that. Don't do this, don't do that. Now we can start looking at the modern day application of why we have so much trouble with the singular issue of language at the level of trauma that we face in 2018, especially in suicide. Now we can talk about the express issue of communication in the English language. The clinical application of healing language, very specific and very definitive, and is extremely difficult to use, doesn't fit the problems that we have to contend with on the issues we face today on a traumatized basis. So there is no words in our indigenous language to describe suicide. The closest you would come to talking about suicide on a indigenous basis, let's say 150 years ago, before contact, you would say suicide is a specific way of taking the Creator's creation and mocking the Creator. So you would have a suicidal person as being seen in our language, not in our eyes, not in our heart, but in our language. The descriptive norm would say that individual is mocking the Creator, defacing the Creator's creation, himself or herself, by taking their own life or threatening to do so. Our traditional language would say taking of your own life means you're rejecting the Creator and you're going in the opposite direction of the direction He's calling you. Because we never had suicide before. There is nothing in our language predicated and built around suicides that we could use to describe it, to have a discussion of it. It's completely absent in our language, because our language doesn't allow us to say we have the wherewithal to reject the Creator. That means you're equal to the Creator. And that's not only what you would call a violation of our original covenant, it's a violation of the very act of being. So we began to adopt ways of dealing with suicide that would not lead us into what we would call the field of guessing or second guessing the intentions of the Creator. What's the best way? We did it in the Great Death, silence. We treated the great deaths and the die-offs with immense silence. And that silence carried on and on through several generations. We did the same thing with suicides, because we had this view on a cosmological basis, on a spiritual basis, that the only way you could describe that person's action is that that person is defying our Creator. Silence was the option. So now we have a specific act that we know is a serious and ongoing epidemic of its own, but our normal response is silence. That brings us specifically to the question of what do we do to take silence out of the equation and bring the discussion of these issues into a healing type of discussion, utilizing a property language, English. And what our property language related to? Taking with the least amount of compensation, getting without having to share. The language we have to deal with the issue of suicide is about taking without compensation, getting without having to share, putting things into perspective that distorts the picture. That's the language we have today to deal with suicide. Our original language doesn't deal with suicide. It can't. So our original language, our original application from the indigenous standpoint is to provide a well of silence over that event. So the two approaches we have, both are, one doesn't work and the other one is destined to fail. So now let's talk about the issue of how the heck do you take a language like English and make it work in a way it's never was supposed to work. Well, there's a little bit of a hope, because English language is also on the stages of evolution. What it was like in 1880 is nothing like it was in 1980. So it's constantly subject to change. So English has one thing going for it that our indigenous language really didn't, and that English, slow as it is, can evolve. So the question today is, okay, do we want to take a really serious look at making English work on the basis of a healing language with a specific use within the context of traumatization, including suicides? The vast majority of people will say yes, but a smaller group of people like myself will say that's extremely difficult to do. You already have a clinical language imposed within the structure of English specific to trauma, and that's a language that generates profits. Nobody in this bright blue world is going to give up profits when they're already making money. If the clinical language of English makes you money, requires a licensing process and a clinical application, you ain't going to give it up. So that brings up another intriguing aspect of the healing activities of trauma. If your language is very profitable, how difficult would it be to change the language? Very, very difficult. So today's student, the people that you're aiming this video at needs to think about the issue of healing and the issue of the application of behavioral health in along the aspect of the language that isn't working makes money for the people that are in control of the language. Don't get all bent out of shape about it. Say, think about, how do I make that language work for my specific, today, in my specific case about the issue of this trauma, this domestic violence, or this OCS problem, or this suicide. So think long and hard about what you want to say before you say it. Rule number 1. Every time you have extreme trauma, think of what it is that you want to convey. And then think about the kinds of application of that conveyance issue. So a student who's involved in the study of these things should by now, in 2018, be able to say trauma lingers, not because we don't want to deal with it or can't deal with it. It lingers because we don't adequately describe it. We don't have the language that says, this is how trauma looks, and this is where you find it, and this is the extent of it. You don't have that. So it's invisible, but it lives in our families, and it's always there. Our new problem is language. Not suicide, not domestic violence, not sexual abuse. Our new problem is language. When you think about it along those lines, it changes your perception of how to conduct healing activities. And that's a really straightforward stance that I think any student can take any given time, is change the way you conduct healing activities, predicated upon the fact that the language you use are predatory in itself. So once you take the predatory aspect of a language and neutralize it, you're halfway there. Everybody talks about resiliency and adaptation as the next paradigm. And to somebody like me, it ended with my mom's generation. We changed it, predicated upon the outside influences. So resilience and adaptation today in the world that you and I occupy, what it's supposed to mean is we need to reconnect with the value system that our parents lived back in the 30s and the 40s. Because World War II was the really, like I said, other big impact that produced people like me. So resilience and adaptation was always a part of our value system. Up until the 60s, mid-60s, my mother's generation was adept at navigating the influence of the missionaries, dealing with the racism of the trading posts and the what you would call the arrogance of the U.S. military. After the 60s, everybody kind of, the change was so abrupt and so complete that it was like in one night everything flip-flopped. The inner strength, the fervent belief in your place in the system and your being tested was so fierce and so strong that it didn't bother them in the way it did later generations. In other words, by bothering, I mean stick to them. My mom's generation would see death as a function of a cosmological order. if you have very big unexplained waves of death like the epidemics, which did occur prior to contact, that cast a different kind of shadow. But that was before my mom's time. The great death, the enormous trauma from the period of the epidemics and the warfare that came out of it had passed before contact. Now we're talking first contact in my region about 1855. My mom was born 1934, so her older brother and sisters were taught certain things. Number one, reconnect with your spiritual values, meaning you don't lose faith in the Creator and the connectivity. And number two, the language that the white man has is filled with stuff that we don't understand. My age group was born between 1947 and 1953. So now we can talk about what my mom's generation did in terms of the communicative norms. Tried very hard to learn English, but it didn't work. So it was rejected as a way to utilize. Uncles and aunts, in my case, and along with my other family members, took on the role of teaching kids how to communicate and how to use language and how to learn values. So by the time the 60s came along, the hierarchy, the authority, the jurisdictional aspects of community and village living was still in place, but the practice had mutated into what you would call a part-time issue. So the second component, after the silence went into effect, was the issue of what happens when somebody dies. In our culture, and this is pretty much true everywhere, you have certain very elaborate ceremonial aspects that you put into place. Could be potlatches, and sometimes it's called rituals. But the ceremonial aspect of saying goodbye and coming to grips with the grief and being supportive of the loss of the family, very extensive, and it's driven by the arranged marriage components, and it's very elaborate for the purpose of putting the grief on the table and sharing it widely with the family or the people that suffered the loss. What happened in a great death? Nobody was able to commemorate these losses. They died without being said goodbye to. They simply died. Now we have two components in the traumatization process. First, you go silent. You don't talk, so you don't bring back these spirits. Number two, in our original traditions, it's impossible to have a person leave you and go on to the next part of the life cycle across the happy hunting ground without saying goodbye properly, because if you don't do that, you antagonize and offend that person's ancestors and your ancestors. So the process of saying goodbye was terminated by the immediate and almost continuous death cycles. So in our traumatization process, the second component was the inability of indigenous peoples to properly commemorate their deceased ones in memory and on time. That was taken away from them. You can't progress and move forward on the basis of health and well-being until you take care of the passing of the people that was with you properly. Original population being scattered far and wide. Great silence came in. One of the commandments, my great uncle Houston Sanford said, they told everybody, don't talk about this stuff. Once the great death is done and the evil is gone, you don't talk about them or call them by name because they'll come back. So the land went quiet. You don't talk about these things. That's when that's when you start looking at what you would call the beginning of the trauma, when our people quit talking about the death. First contact in my region about 1855. So approximately 30 years before that, the country went silent from all of the dying. That silence cast forward is what created these veils over everyday conversation about things like suicide, about abuse. So the silence that began from the Great Death and the inability to deal with the Great Death is where we began to look at the question of the breaking down of the communicative norms within families. When that broke down, it was replaced by what we call the religious overtones of the church and the missionaries. Third component, the medicine man said everybody's got to scatter out and stay away from each other. No more interaction, no more social interaction, no more visiting, no more being happy with each other, no more being glad to see each other. Everybody's going to be siloed out everywhere to ensure that somebody survives. This is a survival tool. This is not what you would call celebration or anything. It's a tool specifically adopted by the medicine people to ensure somebody lived. So by the time the prospectors came in the early 1900s in our region, we had established localities where there was incursions and intrusions. None of them specifically were ever authorized, given permission, or utilized, which creates the last category of the traumatization process, which is take something or anything without regards to the proper protocol and that, when you fast forward, is where you get into the boarding school application. Taking something with giving great offense by taking without explanation or even feel there's a need for it. Number 5 is the issue of what you would call making somebody irrelevant. So you had 5 steps in the traumatization process over a period of about 50 to 80 years, somewhere in there, that just worked in what you would call a synchronized fashion to get from this point to that point, and it involved the whole people. So the ultimate issue in the 1920s was whether or not medicine people were still in charge, in authority, or had any place in what we would call the society that we were talking about. Number 6, internal strife, fights between factions. Not because one faction is right or one faction is wrong, but because they had been divided by the practical application of colonial activities. The military, the churches, and the trading post operators needed to have the medicine people out of the picture because the medicine people had direct ties to a lot of stuff that these economic forces needed to take. This is about the term and the terminology of generational trauma. And I don't want to use that term because it's an imposed colonial application of verbiage that doesn't really convey what happened. But we'll use it because we can say, okay, generational trauma is related to these things then, and carries forward. It wasn't until you broke the internal governing structure down at the community level among the families that domestic violence began to come into its own. And that's when the other types of abuse began to happen. So you have to break down the structure. And that's when you start having real issues, is once you get rid of the structure. Generation after generation, where the language that they adopted continues to evolve or maintains multiple meanings. So you might have 5 generations in a household. Each one of them will use a term, like let's say trauma. It'll have 5 different meanings, or it'll have meanings to 4 generations, but the 5th one, being too young to understand terminology, will simply adopt the confusion of the first 4. That's a short course on why it's so tough to talk about these things in a modern day context. Let's talk about generational trauma in terms of not only short-term impact but long-term impact. And we want to be very clear, generational trauma was in place since the epidemics, but it did not affect the day-to-day thought processes of my mom's generation and before them. They came to grips with these things. My generation, the very first generation that lost the ability to communicate about these things, was not able to accommodate generational trauma. So the 60s period I'm talking about was the first time that you can actually measure the impact of trauma in the villages. The domestic violence, children being abandoned, fights, all of the violent component of things that go haywire appeared in the 60s. And then in the 70s you had single parents, and you had OCS, you had the state assuming more and more control over the process of children in need. In the 80s, you began to really see major issues related to children being born whose parents had spent time in either the drug communities or alcohol. So by the time the 90s came along, irregardless of whether we had communicative skills or not, the ability to reflect the norms that my mom's generation had on a communicative basis no longer was in place. So what does that mean to you and I and Tina? Well, we can struggle and scramble and play all these word games for the rest of our lives, or we can reinvent the norm. We can say, let's stop using English in the way it's presented to us that causes the confusion and further lengthen the life of the turmoil. Let's reinvent the language. You have to be really cautious about not only the timeline, but the question of the boarding school experience, which was designed for the specific purpose of removing the native out of the native. That was all it was about. The trauma that you and I have to contend with today is related to the issue of the individual not having a person, not being related to anything inside of themselves. That's the component that allows for suicide. That's the part that allows for extremely violent actions. That's where you can have neglect of children. So the inability of a person to identify themselves as a person is where the disconnect comes from. That began in the 60s. Many people who went to boarding school, in spite of the horrendous treatment they got, hung on to their inner self and their identification at all costs. Some of them got mean, yes. Most of them were affected to one degree or another. Some became what you would call damaged beyond repair. But the key point is not everyone reacted to those beatings and humiliations, in many cases sexual abuse, in the same way that we have reactions today. You have a whole different kind of response mechanism within the people that are part of the trauma issues today that didn't exist even in the days of the boarding school. So yes, you had immense impact, immense trauma, but you had a different response mechanism back then. And this is the point that I'm trying to make. The English language is very difficult to impart where the dividing line is. If you took a person out of the boarding school era, let's say 1940, at the same age, let's say 14 years of age in 1940, and you took a 14-year-old in 1990, and you put them into the same exact situation with the same parameters in terms of trauma and what have you, it would be two complete response, two complete language, different language, and two alien, what you The best way to put it is their ability to absorb information would be vastly different. The boarding school student at 14 years of age, even traumatized, still could process information. The 14-year-old in 1990, being traumatized, will not process information. The question of original trauma, or where it all began, is very important. Number one, the Athabascan language that my mom's generation were a part of were predicated upon a number of different kinds of uses of the language. There was the medicine man trade language. There was the chief's oratory, peacemaking, reconciliation language, which is where we want to go on trauma. There's the everyday family, geographical dialects among the clans, and there was the kind of a meeting of the dialects among marriages. You might find somebody from Chitna married to somebody from Antasta. They'd have dialectical differences. So they would have to merge those dialectical differences as part of their learning to be with each other. So you had all those in play, plus you had two symbolic language. One was a trail code used commonly among the clans and the families to tell each other where they've been. Then you had medicine man trail code specific to their moving of goods on the trade trail, which was not taught, that it was handed down by the medicine people. So we have these communicative norms that were specifically utilized for specific issues. And dealing with grief, trauma, hurt, pain, healing, those required specific applications of the language. So generational trauma, or as I would say, collateral damage from immediate and great death is what we're going to get into. Prior to, in my region, but it was statewide, prior to contact in our region, a series of epidemics was brought or introduced into the country. One of them that I know of was actually introduced for the purpose of removing obstacles to trade, and that was smallpox. It was very common from the lower 48 through Canada into our country to bring infected blankets into the region that you wanted to get rid of the medicine people who controlled the trade. However, other kinds of epidemics were introduced also inadvertently and by conditions that were not related to, for instance, TB was not introduced, it was worldwide. It just so happens that indigenous population lived a lifestyle that was very easy for TB to come in and stay in. So the beginning issue with traumatization goes through those four phases. Now here's what we run into in the early 1900s, is the remaining medicine people beginning to warm up to the idea that the evil has passed and that things were finally settling down, began looking at the question of reasserting themselves. But by this time they found out that not only were they dismissed as being demonic purveyors of evil by the churches that had come into being while they were out surviving, but also their stock in trade, which is the economic regeneration of a region or a nation, which was their charge before the epidemics, also had been sideswiped. So the medicine people who thought that they were still in charge of the health and well-being of communities, families, and the nation were left on the sidelines. No explanation, no nothing. Just, you're no longer relevant, you represent the devil, so just stay out of our way. Kaboom, number 5. So the great death that happened was not traumatizing in itself. The response was, what did we do wrong to be revisited by these things again? What created the trauma was the fact that at the time of the Great Death, shortly thereafter, we had contact with the white man. That's when things started going south. You began to realize that traumatization is a function of language, or the inability of utilizing language to deal with it. We also try to explain traumatization in a way as something of a monster wave that came out of the past and never really, it just kept going generation by generation. And we also talked about the fact that our terminology was very limited in terms of trying to explain these practices and activities that occurred in terms of a singular term called colonization. If you took all of those trauma that I talked about and put it in a box and set it on a table, and if you took all of the activities, all of the things that happen in a normal colonization process, starting with the doctrine of discoveries, all of the boarding, that's where the boarding school stuff belongs, in a colonization process. If you took the two and you wrapped them up, they weigh the same, they look the same, they have the same feel, they have the same, you can't tell the difference between the two. One is called traumatization, what you would call generational trauma. The other one is called colonization. And they are absolute twins. But if you went into colonization, you have a written history that makes no sense to somebody like me. The Lieutenant Allen expedition that I talked about, this history, the colonization process, doesn't say in it that Lieutenant Allen was very cautious about finding, looking, or identifying places of authority. His job was to report back, there are no authority, there are no sovereign nations in here. We can plant the flag. So you have colonization and generational trauma as mirror twins of each other, but they are in completely separate boxes. Don't put the two together. They both have the same impact, they both have the same effect, they both work the same way, but they are different animals completely. And what we do today on a long-term basis is use the two terms interchangeably. That's like saying, well, a bear has really big hooves. Really? How'd that work?